This episode includes explicit language. This is Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. On this edition, a look at how the city handled one of the wettest winters on record.
That's the reason a lot of us live here, and we love living here because it's generally just really benign and beautiful around here. But when we go big.
In fact, we were under the impression and notified by our National Weather Service that we could anticipate not even an inch of rain. And in fact, what we saw within a 24-hour period was a 5.5 inches of rain.
They were making us move every week, back and forth. Didn't matter if it was raining, they didn't give a shit.
I'm Mel Baker. This is Civic. When I first moved to San Francisco in the early 90s, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the weather. It was foggy in the summer, a bit rainy in the winter. My biggest worries were, did I need more layers or should I pack an umbrella? As I became more of a Californian, weather concerns mostly seemed tied to the snowpack in the Sierra. Will we be asked to ration our water use during the summer? Now the weather in the Bay Area seems a lot more dynamic than it was when I first moved here.
The skyline of San Francisco looking more like an image from Mars. The orange glow from wildfires burning miles away, shrouding the city's landmarks, the smoke blocking out the sun.
That was Sky News out of Britain describing September 9th of 2020 when the skies turned orange. Before that, there was a deadly heat wave in September of 2017 when temperatures in San Francisco reached 106 degrees and 6 people in the Bay Area died. This past fall, a strong La Niña weather pattern promised more drought and a drier than usual winter. Then atmospheric rivers started rolling over the state at the end of the year. Here is how NBC TV describes them.
An atmospheric river is a narrow current of wind that carries plumes of rich moisture, stretching for hundreds or even thousands of miles high across the sky, kind of like a big floating river.
That series of storms included the New Year's Eve storm that dumped 5.5 inches of rain in San Francisco in less than a day. That's more than a fifth of the total rain we get in an average year. I spoke to Brian Garcia, the warning coordination meteorologist for the National Weather Service in the San Francisco Bay Area. So what opened the storm door in such a way that we were able to get one large atmospheric river after another? Normally there's that high pressure zone that kind of sits on us and everything bounces over the top up to the Pacific Northwest. That's been the pattern pretty steadily for the last few years. What changed, especially since we were kind of in the macro sense looking at a La Niña pattern, which meant generally on average drier in the northern part of the state?
Yeah, that's right. And we've been on La Nina for the past several years now. This was our triple dip La Nina year. So we expected very similar conditions to the previous 2 years with the storm track heading up and over us. What happens, though, is you might have these broad scale kind of basin wide oscillations like the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is the El Nino to La Nina, as well as the neutral phase across the equatorial tropical Pacific. And if they all come together in the right way, they can override a strong entrenched signal of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. We can have El Nino years that are extremely dry. And conversely, we can have La Nina years that are extremely wet. It's not unheard of. It's just not the norm. So these other intra-seasonal oscillations definitely played a big factor in bringing in all these pineapple expresses or atmospheric rivers.
So is this kind of like rolling snake eyes? You really had to have all sorts of different factors occur at the same time to make this happen during this kind of general weather pattern.
I'm not a gambling person, but yeah, rolling snake eyes. Yeah, it's definitely like that. The odds of it all coming together like this are generally very low, but when they do, it's high impact. That's kind of the story for our area for the most part. You know, we are a low frequency, high impact type place. That's the reason a lot of us live here, and we love living here because it's generally just really benign and beautiful around here. But when we go big.
So the big question I had was, how well did the city handle this monster winter, specifically that New Year's Eve storm that felt like the city was drowning with widespread flooding as well as downed trees and power lines, and of course how unhoused people were being helped. San Francisco's Department of Emergency Management has an elaborate system to prepare all of the city's departments for a major storm starting 96 hours before it arrives, in this instance on December 28th. Under the city's own pre-storm response timeline, the National Weather Service and the Department of Emergency Management are supposed to be in daily contact about the incoming weather systems. Despite the preparation, Mayor Breed's administration took a lot of criticism following the New Year's Eve storm, something reported in local media.
Right, so one of the hardest hit areas in San Francisco is the Mission. We've taken you there over the past few days, Folsom Street and 17th, where a lot of businesses are. They've been dealing with flooding all week.
Yeah, NBC Bay Area's Robert Hanna joins us now from the Mission in San Francisco. And Robert, we just heard from Mayor Breed, who's been really taking a lot of criticism in the last several days because people where you are say, you know what, they didn't warn us in the Mission that this was coming, and they didn't put those floodgates out like they usually do last weekend. It led to a lot of damage.
That's right, and there's probably going to be even more criticism coming when they get through this storm here.
During Mayor Breed's press conference on January 3rd, she seemed to be shifting blame for the city's response to the National Weather Service forecast.
In fact, we were under the impression and notified by our National Weather Service that we could anticipate not even an inch of rain. And in fact, what we saw within a 24-hour period was a 5.5 inches of rain, which is one of the second largest amounts of rains that we have seen within a 24-hour period.
In that January 3rd press conference, Mary Ellen Carroll, the director of the Department of Emergency Management, reiterated the mayor's claims that they weren't warned and had to quickly open the Emergency Operations Center on New Year's Eve morning.
I want to echo my appreciation for all of my colleagues and the countless public servants, including our 911 dispatchers and emergency managers at the Department of Emergency Management who responded on New Year's Eve. Official forecasts, as the mayor noted, were less than an inch, and we obviously got much, much more than was expected. Our city employees rallied, and we activated our EOC late morning when we realized that what was happening actually was a little different than the actual forecast.
Brian Garcia questioned the city's claims that they weren't warned of how much rain was coming.
We're obviously watching the weather for days and weeks out, and when we see something, we try to make sure we highlight those potential threats out to our partner agencies. And so we started messaging that even on the 26th and 27th, we started putting out information for the New Year's Eve system. We issued that flood watch on December 28th. We definitely saw something coming, and we were messaging it out via social media, via our products and services that we send out, as well as through email briefings that we send out to our media partners, as well as our emergency management partners and first responders.
I understand the city was really thinking a lot about the fireworks display. The first time since COVID, they were going to be able to show the fireworks and trying to figure out whether those were going to get flooded out.
Yeah, there was definitely a focus for all of us to see if the rain was going to clear out by then. At the same time, on the briefing that we provided on December 28th for their New Year's Eve citywide briefing, we were talking about the wind and the rain across our entire area, including the city, and how nasty it was going to be during the daytime and even into the early evening hours for people even trying to get to the city to see the fireworks. So that was going to be a significant challenge for people. So yeah, the fireworks were definitely a bit of a focus, but there was definitely talk about, and we definitely discussed the threat of the weather coming in during the daytime.
It's hard to know why Mayor Breed's office chose to make the less than 1 inch assertion for the New Year's Eve flooding forecast at the very start of her January 3rd press conference. Weeks later, in late February, the city appears to have backed away from the spat with the Weather Service. I asked Adrian Bekele, the deputy director of the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management, whether the confusion over the forecast affected the city's response.
So the discrepancy of whether it's an inch of rain or 2 inches of rain, that we would have continued our operational response and our operational protocol in the same way. Even with that hindsight 2020, our operational posture would have remained the same. And so we learned a lot from these storms of identifying opportunities to refine how the city responds to extreme weather and extreme precipitation. And we've also been able to really refine with the National Weather Service the ways that we as a city gather and track the forecasts that they provide to us and the models to ensure that we are always using the most updated information that the National Weather Service has provided to us in order to inform our operational response posture.
So there was basically thinking it was going to be about 2.5 inches. It turned out to be 5+ inches in one day. That didn't change the response. You were already full out at that point.
We were full out in terms of our operational response, yes. Just in general, because the built infrastructure of San Francisco is not built to handle 6 inches of rain or 5.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, we're going to see inevitable flooding.
Do you have kind of a number? Is there a level at which the city just kind of brushes off a rain event like 1.5 inches, 2 inches? Is there a threshold at which you're expecting flooding in the city?
In general, it's less about the overall precipitation amount and more about the volume of precipitation that we experience in particular areas of the city within a short period of time. So 1 inch of rain over 24 hours can flood some areas, but 1 inch of rain in 1 hour in one specific area can make it a lot better or worse. So it all really depends on how much rain falls, exactly where and exactly when. And unfortunately, that's almost impossible to predict.
Kristen Hogan with the Department of Emergency Management told us after the interview that the pre-storm response timeline is being modified. She said, quote, "While we regularly get daily information from the National Weather Service, and storms tend to change dramatically as we get closer to the event, we have updates that will be incorporated into the plan, including recommendations of embedding a National Weather Service specialist into the Emergency Operations Center for those storms predicted to have great impact." Brian Garcia is happy to move beyond pointing fingers over the forecast.
The city of San Francisco and the National Weather Service have a long-standing relationship, and we have a good relationship. And through these events that we went through on New Year's Eve and even going through into the early part of 2023 here, we've even learned better on how we need to communicate and how we need to coordinate the information coming across from our office to their office. You're always learning how to communicate better, and we continue to look forward to many years of a strong partnership with the great city of San Francisco.
For most of us snug in our homes, the sound of rain on the roof can actually be comforting, creating a sense of being warm and cozy. I make something warm to drink, check the webcams from Yosemite again, and see all that snow that shut down the national park to visitors. But then, of course, you think about the people living on the street with, at best, a cold and soggy tent for shelter, and that cozy moment passes. The last big storms to pummel San Francisco happened during the winter of 2016 to 17. The point-in-time count of unhoused people grew from more than 6,800 during the last wet winter to more than 7,700 people this winter. In the days that followed the New Year's Eve storms, San Francisco Public Press reporters Jessica Prado and Madison Alvarado went out to see how homeless people were dealing with the weather. You can read their reporting at sfpublicpress.org.
So over the course of 3 days, we visited different neighborhoods in San Francisco. We went to the Fillmore, Japantown, Civic Center, Tenderloin, the Mission neighborhood, also the Bayview, Hayes Valley, and Lower Nob Hill. And I feel like when we went to different areas of the city, they did give us a different scope of what was happening there. I mean, some places like the Bayview, people are able to be more settled down and be able to stay in that space versus being in the Civic Center or being in Japantown where people are constantly in the move and they would have to seek shelter if they want to have any accommodations for that night. So yeah, it was like a different experience to be able to see different parts of the city. There really is a high need on the streets that is not being met.
Yeah, and I think to add on to what Yessi was saying, when you hear that list of neighborhoods, there were a lot of resources that were concentrated in certain areas. So lots of shelters near kind of Civic Center and the Tenderloin, or lots of places where people can go and get food. And actually, when we were visiting a shelter and a dining room down in the Bayview, we actually heard that at the end of the day, one of the places where we had visited earlier in, I believe, the Civic Center area would actually bus people at the end of the day from the St. Anthony Foundation down to Mother Brown's because they knew that there were shelter options down there. So people were also themselves being moved between those two neighborhoods.
So it was really a mishmash and depends on where you are, what community you're in, how many open shelters there are, whether there's even a possibility of getting in out of the rain.
Mm-hmm. And I think also just your own knowledge of knowing what the resources are and your ability to, access city websites that publish this information or get alerts. I mean, if you don't have a phone, it might be hard to know where you can go because you don't know where they are, or maybe you know of a shelter, but you don't know how to get there from where you are. And we went into the library and right when it opened, and one of the first things we noticed was that so many people went to the computers. And I think that's a really key resource for people, but not everyone on the street has that. So it can be hard.
We did see a person that had been drenched in the rain, probably for over an hour. And then when we came back, because we had gone to visit St. Anthony's diner room to go talk to more people. And then when we came back, he was still there. And we noticed that nobody had actually approached him. So the first thing that we did is we went to go ask if he was okay. We didn't even ask for an interview. We went to ask, are you okay or do you need any help? And then all he could muster is that, he was cold and he would like help. So what we did is that we went back to our car and then we got some supplies for him, some dry clothes that he can change into. But then once we came back and we tried to help him change, he wasn't really being responsive. And that's when we thought he really needs some other kind of help.
He was shaking under an emergency blanket. His clothes were sopping wet. I mean, it was scary. And he had been shaking on the ground for quite some time. And so we decided to call. And I think this gets to one of the other issues in the city was we did not know what number to call. We were in an area where there were a lot of people around, but we weren't sure if we should call 911 and if that would escalate the situation in a way. I mean, this just seemed like someone who needed help. He was not being very responsive, so we weren't sure if we should call the police. We looked up, and the Healthy Streets Operations Center has a phone number that you can call if you're seeking shelter, but it's a voicemail, and they say that if you are a citizen calling on behalf of someone experiencing homelessness, they're not going to return the call. It says that on the website. And so then we finally just decided to call 311 because we just figured hopefully we could talk to someone on the phone and they'd get us in contact with the right people. And eventually got a real person on the other line and were able to explain the situation. And they actually transferred us to a non-emergency police line. And then we were answering questions, about his physical appearance, what race was he? How old was he? Did he seem violent? Did it look like he had been using drugs? Just questions like that. And so we were trying to answer to the best of our ability and really emphasize, he was completely harmless. He didn't look like he had a weapon or anything like that. He just looked like he needed help. So they sent over the street crisis response team probably within a half hour, I want to say. And so they came over and were asking him questions and took his vitals and things like that. Yeah, it was just a really harrowing experience to go through and see someone who so obviously needed help and was just out there without the resources to get it. And eventually, we heard that he was going to be taken to Soma Rise, which is a location in the city where people can get help detoxing and have a safe place to stay.
And are there groups or people out on the street that are looking for people in distress like that, especially on a day when it's pouring rain?
There's the street crisis team, which is basically responsible to these kind of emergencies. But they don't come out unless they're called. That's one thing that we notice is that there's a lot of people that need help and they don't have a phone to call for help. So unfortunately, these teams cannot go out to help these people. It definitely takes a bystander to make that call.
A spokesperson with the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing did tell us that part of their inclement weather protocols is increasing wellness checks, but it wasn't really clear to us, what was constituting a wellness check versus what wasn't.
I asked Adrienne Bekele with the DEM about the city's efforts to help the unhoused. Our reporters were out in the streets checking on the unhoused in 8 different locations in the city. One issue they found was that people who might have been willing to go and take shelter who had not already done so were having a really hard time getting information on when those facilities were, whether they still had room to bring people in, especially if they didn't have phones, which a lot of unhoused folks don't have. Do you know if there are any plans to improve the coordination and reach to those people?
During this storm series, we were very proactive with our street response teams and our homeless outreach teams to provide that level of support and that level of information. We did a vast amount of outreach to our known encampment areas, not just to encourage people to seek shelter indoors in our expanded shelter system that we had pop-up shelter availability for these storms, but also to help educate people experiencing homelessness or the unhoused population on hazards that might be in the area where they were camping, whether it was scaffolding nearby, potential for trees falling in the area, or being in an area known to flooding. We are always looking to improve our outreach capacity and our outreach capabilities, but we do feel like that we have a really good starting point that we built on during this storm.
When they were out in the field, one thing is they encountered a person shivering under a blanket, and they had a hard time figuring out which department to call and who to reach out to. And these are journalists that cover this issue a lot. They did get somebody to come out. They were very prompt. A hot team was there, and the guy was taken and given some care. But it also seemed a bit confusing as an average person who saw somebody in distress trying to figure out how do we get help to this person without, say, bringing a whole-on police response when the person was not threatening.
I do want to very specifically say that if there is ever any question about life safety or any concern for anyone's well-being, 911 should always be the call. Our 911 dispatchers are trained to send the right resource for that particular problem. If there is a medical emergency that someone's suffering due to cold or due to rain, potential hypothermia, they will send a medical response in order to help that person. So 911 was definitely the right call in this circumstance.
Calling 911 when someone might be in distress isn't always the obvious answer. Remember that January 3rd press conference? Several speakers, including Fire Chief Janine Nicholson, discouraged people from using 911 for anything less than an emergency.
I can't stress it enough. Call 911 for life-threatening emergencies only. We still have to run all of our critical 911 calls, whether it's a cardiac arrest or a car accident or a fire.
But what is a life-threatening emergency? Recall that Yessie and Madison had to spend some time talking to that shivering man to determine whether his life was in danger. After the interview, DEM clarified that, quote, if someone is concerned about someone's safety, that is an emergency, and 911 should be called. This includes someone who is unsheltered and whose health and safety are compromised due to exposure to the extremely inclement weather. However, it is not appropriate to call 911 for damaged property, how to get sandbags, power outages, etc. While the city did outreach to unhoused people and open more emergency shelter spaces, they also continued the so-called encampment resolutions, or sweeps, during the storms. Jessica and Madison learned of 2 of those sweeps done by the Department of Public Works and spoke with a man who was being moved.
How long have you been staying here?
On this spot, maybe a month.
Has DPW and HOT come through before at all, like doing these kinds of cleanups?
At least like once every 2 weeks, once a week. They were making us move every week, back and forth, back and forth. Didn't matter if it was raining, and they didn't give a shit. They come so fast, they don't give us a chance to like gather all our stuff. And then as we're not looking, trying to get our important stuff, they'll get stuff like this and just throw it. We turn around and our shit's gone. It's like, man, they get off on throwing our shit away. It's crazy.
Are there other things you feel like the city could be doing better, like offering different services or anything like that? Or is it just mostly the dumpster that you think would be helpful?
The dumpster would be helpful, but the navigation centers are bullshit. You go in there, you got to deal with a bunch of J-cats or crazy people that pick fights with you literally for no reason. Yeah, they offer you housing, but you got to jump through hoops to get it. And it's not, I know it's not going to be easy, but it shouldn't be. I shouldn't have to deal with shit like that.
Jessica said the city was offering temporary shelter stays to people in the 2 encampments, but few they spoke to were taking the offers. A significant number of unhoused people live in cars or RVs. The city has set aside a vehicle triage center in the Bayview with toilets and some meals provided. But our reporters Jessica and Madison found that parking lot isn't the best place to shelter during storms.
We went to the vehicle triage center in the Bayview, and basically it's surrounded by water right now. There is the bay on one side, and then you have the flooded streets on the other side. I mean, there was like vehicles that were like under 2-3 feet underwater. So basically what the city did is that when the street started to flood, they started to ask the people that were living on that street that was next to the Huntersview Expressway, which is next to the Candlestick Point State Recreation Area. They basically asked all the people that were parked there to come inside to the vehicle triage center to stay away from the flooding. And some people did take the opportunity. Obviously, there was one van that remained there, so they couldn't be moved. But most of the people that were living there went. And I feel like now they have an opportunity to actually seek permanent supportive housing. Living in the Bayview, everything is really far away, especially if you're living in the vehicle triage center. They would have to drive out, and if they're trying to find food or other resources, or even like public transportation, like it's really far from everything. So I just feel like even living here, it has its own difficulties just with the lack of resources around it. And I feel like the storms just added to that.
So what did we learn about the city's response to people caught out in the storms with no place to take cover? The city did expand its winter shelter capacity. It did offer shelter to people that outreach teams encountered. But for unhoused people, learning about shelter on their own was challenging. Much of that information required having a smartphone to find it online or the ability to phone specific shelters. Despite the heavy rains, some people living in tents had disincentives to go into those expanded shelters, ranging from the inability to shelter with a partner or pets, or having to abandon some of their belongings on the street for what would only be a short-term shelter from the rain. People living in their vehicles may have had better protection from the elements, but even those in the vehicle triage center faced challenges connecting with services or jobs from such a remote location. So what was it like for city workers on the streets and in the command center? Adrian Bekele said it was an all-hands-on-deck moment during a time when many workers were taking time off for the holidays.
It was definitely hectic, but what we do see actually, unfortunately, in the emergency world is a tendency for these types of events to happen on nights, weekends, and holidays. So it's not unfamiliar to us to have to activate the Emergency Operations Center or do emergency response over a weekend, over a holiday, or throughout the night.
After the December and January storms, the city asked home and business owners affected by the weather to fill out a survey that would help the city appeal for aid from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA.
We had 134 valid survey responses from people who either own, rent, or lease a residence or a business in San Francisco. And of that 134, we had 117 responses about their residences and 17 responses about their businesses. In general, the majority of the respondents were concentrated in the Marina, in the Mission, Bernal Heights, Glen Park, Castro, Potrero Hill, and Dolores Heights. And many of those reported flood damage specifically. And many, although were insured, did not have flood insurance. So the purpose of the survey itself was to help San Francisco understand the community impact that the storm had that we were unable to capture in different ways.
So did you learn anything interesting from the data that seemed to be outliers, that, wow, there's claims going on over here? Or was this kind of what you would have expected in a major storm event?
It was as expected in a major storm event. I think that we know the topography of San Francisco. We're built on a bunch of hills. That means we also have a bunch of valleys. And so that means floodwaters are going to accumulate in those low-lying areas. And so the areas that we saw the highest impact were definitely the areas we saw a lot of 311 calls coming in during the storm and are in those areas that are low-lying in the city.
The Department of Emergency Management told us that emergency funds from FEMA haven't been authorized, but that, quote, the final decision from FEMA was to provide residents and businesses with Small Business Administration disaster loan assistance. Residents and businesses must apply for the low-rate disaster assistance at an office at the War Memorial Building on Van Ness Avenue. As of March 22nd, the city has activated the Emergency Operations Center 3 times in response to a series of storms, totaling 13 days of operations. DEM had planned an exercise to game out best responses, but told us, quote, we captured lessons learned during the January response and have already begun applying those lessons learned in our subsequent activations. During those activations, we met most of the objectives of the exercise, unquote. Long-term plans for mitigating flood risk are carried out by the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. Dennis Herrera, the general manager of the SFPUC, spoke during that January 3rd press conference. He said the city has been working on projects to try and mitigate the flooding in some low-lying neighborhoods.
We have 3 separate projects in low-lying neighborhoods of the city. Many of you are familiar with them. 15th and Wawona, 17th and Folsom, and the Lower Alamany. And those are designed to increase the volume of stormwater that sewers can handle. And collectively, these 3 projects reflect a $600 million investment from the PUC in trying to get some more flood resiliency. The 15th and Wawona project is already under construction.
The 15th and Wawona project began last May. The Lower Alamany project won't begin work until at least 2025, and there's no start date listed for the Folsom and 17th Street project. The SFPUC has handed out $2.5 million of grants to schools and nonprofits to fund rain gardens, green roofs, and other green infrastructure projects to help slow down and redirect floodwaters in the future. So what's the report card for San Francisco's response to our wild and wet winter? There were communication problems. The decision to argue over the New Year's Eve weather forecast may have had more to do with politics than policy, and was later dropped. Given conflicting instructions, San Franciscans may have been confused about when to call 911, especially around helping homeless people. Information for where people living outside can find shelter generally requires access to a smartphone or the internet. Direct outreach to the homeless is limited by staffing constraints and the fact that those needing the information move around a lot. Overall, the city's response to protecting people in need was hampered by the same factors that have led to so many people living on the streets: a lack of long-term housing and temporary shelters, which are often considered by the homeless to be worse than staying outside. The city knows where the most problematic flooding areas are and has plans to mitigate many of them, but those infrastructure projects are years from completion. The La Niña pattern officially ended on March 9th, but it's unclear if we'll see an El Niño or a neutral pattern develop later in the year. More from our friend at the National Weather Service.
Last time we came out of a drought was the winter of 16-17. And in January and February of 2017, we got inundated by multiple atmospheric rivers and had a lot of flooding around the area. And then in October of 2017, as a lot of people remember who were here at the time, we had the North Bay fires break out. I'm not saying there's a correlation there, but we always need to be ready for wildfire season. And these rains are just going to provide more fuel for the fires this summer and fall, with all the grass crops growing because of the rain. In California, we typically end major droughts with major floods. And this was no different. This has happened multiple times throughout California's history. Is this related to climate change at all? The way that it's related to climate change are the extremes at which we're doing this. And we're really, like Daniel Swain coined years ago, we're getting that weather whiplash. So we are seeing those higher heights and lower lows, but in terms of the frequency of them happening, it's not happening any more frequent than historically. It's just getting deeper and higher at the same time.
Higher, like the Yosemite snowpack I mentioned. The snow was so deep in the national park this winter that at least one of the park's webcams was buried. By early March, more than 40 inches of snow fell in Yosemite Valley. surpassing the previous record of 36 inches set in 1969. The last 5 years taught us what drought made worse from climate change looks like. Now the weather whiplash of record rains and snow in the Sierra is telling us what the other extreme can look like. And the extremes we experience today from climate change are only expected to become more unpredictable and, well, extreme. Dealing with the extremes is now something the state and cities like San Francisco must be prepared for from one season to the next. That will mean more resources to mitigate the damage from fire, smoke, floods, and mudslides. Residents must be ready to deal with a new normal that may never be normal again. I'm Mel Baker. You've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP LP 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Additional music was supplied by the Blue Dot Sessions. Our team includes producer Liana Wilcox and contributor Sylvie Sturm. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Our staff includes publisher Lila LaHood, executive director Michael Stoll, development director Lisa Rudman, copy chief Kurt Aguilar, photojournalist and reporter Jessica Prado, reporter Madison Alvarado. Civic airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on KSFP, new episodes on Thursdays. Subscribe to our podcast by looking for Civic from the San Francisco Public Press wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.